Kia ora, welcome to another Cahoots tool training video. As usual, this video is not intended to be explicit training. This is supposed to be a recap, assuming that you've had training in the Cahoots Workshop through our system. This is a jigsaw. A jigsaw is used for making intricate or curved or funny shaped cuts in relatively thin timber. It's a much more approachable, beginner-friendly, usually a safer tool than the more powerful saws, various circular saws. But it's also limited, it's quite slow, and it is difficult to make really regular straight cuts with this saw. So compared to something like the plunge saw running on the rail, if you wanted to cut a straight edge all the way along this piece of timber, the jigsaw would be a poor choice. It would take a long time and it would be hard to maintain accuracy. Having said that, you can run the jigsaw against guides. So if you clamp a piece of timber to the top and you run your jigsaw along the side of that piece of timber, you can get a very nice straight cut, but it will still take a long time and it's a poor choice. Jigsaws can cut through metal or wood. The saw blade needs to be appropriate for the material that you're cutting, and you can check with the packet or the manufacturer of the saw blades. Typically, larger numbers of small teeth, so fine teeth, are used for cutting metals, and a coarse pitch, so a smaller number of larger teeth, are used for cutting timber. You also get hybrid blades that kind of do both. There's some flex in the blade, and it does not always sit perfectly true to this base plate. So it's not great at cutting really square cuts, and even by adjusting the base plate, it's not great at making precise miter cuts. If you're creating holes in the middle of some material, the jigsaw is great. You can drill a pilot hole just big enough to get the blade through, and then you can pop the jigsaw in and go from there. In order to use the jigsaw safely, you need to make sure that the workpiece is secure. When cutting with the jigsaw, you're putting quite a bit of force into the material, and so you need to make sure that you have clamped your workpiece in place. And as always, you want to clamp it in both directions. This piece won't move that way, but it will move that way. So now the workpiece is really solid. You also need to check that the blade is secure. These blades can obviously be changed. It varies with the different jigsaws how to change the blade. So you can check the manufacturer's instructions. Often there is a quick release, or there is a small screw that usually takes an Allen key or a hex bit to undo and tighten. This blade is nice and secure, and it's sitting in the little guide roller on the back here. That's what's going to provide force to keep the blade moving through the material when you push on the tool. Some jigsaws have speed adjustment. That's useful because if you're cutting in harder materials like metals, you need to slow the cut down. If you're cutting in softer materials like plywood or softwoods, you can speed the cut up. Slow speeds can also be useful for really delicate curves. The blade on a jigsaw oscillates, it goes in and out. It cuts on the upstroke usually, which means that it's pulling the saw down into the material every time it cuts. That's a good thing. However, the blade does have to go down again through the material, and if you're turning through a tight curve, the blade can bind and push the saw up out of the cut. That's called kickback. And it's not as dangerous as with some of the other saws, but the saw can end up lifted out of the cut, and then the blade can impact the surface, can break the blade, but it can throw the saw around a bit in your hand. It's important to always keep down pressure on the saw to prevent that, and to feel the saw's tendency to push up as you're in a tight curve. As you feel it, you can adjust the curve, or you can slow down, and you can make sure that you have enough downforce on the jigsaw. Another way of dealing with that hazard is making sure that you don't have a hand on the workpiece like this. Both hands can be on the saw, or if you are cutting with just one hand on the saw, which is less advisable, your other hand is out of the way. If it's down here, there's potential to skewer your hand. Jigsaws are not as loud as some of the other saws, but they're loud enough that we still want to wear hearing protection. Eye protection is really important with a jigsaw. They make a lot of dust. And often when you're cutting, you're looking at the blade, you're making sure that it's going along your line or along your mark where you need it to go. And so when you're in this position, a lot of that sawdust is getting flicked up directly into your face, which also necessitates a dust mask. As always, there's a risk of entanglement, and so no long hair or hair tied up securely in a bun, no dangly clothes, no hoodie toggles, dangling jewelry, things like that. The saw blade on a jigsaw can get hot, can generate a lot of friction, particularly when you're cutting curves. So when you take the saw out of a cut, the blade can be hot, particularly if you're going to change the blade. Watch out for that. Blades can break. It can be a result of kickback, and sometimes the blade will just be stuck in the piece of wood, and occasionally the blade can break in free space and send pieces of blade flying. Usually just one or two pieces. It doesn't fragment, but it's just another reason that we're wearing eye protection. Because jigsaws oscillate, they also vibrate, and that means that with extended use they can cause hand-arm vibration syndrome, which can cause nerve damage. Now, this would be from significantly extended use, but avoid using them for very long periods of time or for very large cuts for that reason. Finally, since jigsaws are cutting in free space, the workpiece needs to overhang the edge of a bench. It should overhang by the minimum amount necessary, but it's very important to check the path underneath the saw to make sure there's clearance for the blade. Make sure that you're not going to cut into the bench top, and also make sure that you're not going to cut into the power cord or anything else that is vital. Cutting into the power cord, obviously, there's a risk of electric shock. So, with our workpiece securely clamped so it can't move, we're going to make a cut. We're going to just make a little corner cut here. We're going to come in and cut a curve. When we start, we place the platen, the base plate, on the piece of timber. We can slide up so the blade is against the edge of the timber, but if we try and start it now, there'll be friction between the blade and the timber, and it can cause the saw to be moved around, dragged, jumped in our hands, that kind of thing. So we want to back off slightly, make sure that the blade is not touching the timber yet. When we pull the trigger, we'll let the saw come up to full speed before we push the saw into the wood. And so you see, the jigsaw is really very easy to use. If you are stopping a cut in the middle of a piece of timber, allow the saw to come to a complete stop before lifting out. Otherwise, again, the blade, during retraction, can hit the surface of the timber, break the blade, throw the saw in your hand, that kind of thing. If you can imagine, if this blade is oscillating and I bring it close to the surface of the timber, it's going to hit the timber and it's going to kick the saw around in my hand. And that is the jigsaw. It's a really versatile tool, really useful for all kinds of things, very approachable, very beginner friendly. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask Cahoots staff. Feel free to ask for refresher training if you need it. Otherwise, come down here and make something.